And we have this partnership with them that we can, and I think should, consider a divine relationship of mutual reciprocity.
Yeah.
You know, and the way that we work with the cows determines how they end up behaving.
Yeah.
You know, and the way that we have ended up using all, not just cows, but all ruminant animals in the West and now worldwide, is a destructive practice.
Yeah.
So there is some truth in these narratives about how cows destroy the environment.
Yeah.
There is.
Welcome to the Fallen Frequency Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Fallon, your guide through the world of music, art, and living life with a vibrational twist. Welcome to this special episode of the podcast. Today I sit down with a true Renaissance mind, Joseph Gyovai. Joseph is a woodworker, builder, artist, and philosopher whose life reflects a rare integration of skill, wisdom, and lived experience. He built his off-grid Earthship home by hand in Taos, New Mexico, and crafting not just a shelter, but a living relationship with land, materials, and the elements. His way of life is not theory. It is embodiment, and I mean truly embodiment. In this episode, we dive deep into the intelligence of nature, guided by Joseph's wide-reaching knowledge and fierce curiosity. We explore the Gaia theory and what it means to live as part of a self-regulating Earth organism. We question mainstream narratives around climate change and examine how science itself has been shaped, often distorted by industry and profit. We also discuss the root causes of desertification, how once lush lands become barren, and the vital role of hydrological cycles and ruminant species in restoring ecosystems. Joseph shares powerful insights into holistic land management, the soil carbon sponge, and biological web of life that connects the health of our soil, our food, and our bodies. This conversation was so rich and layered that the camera decided to stop rolling halfway through. So we ended up recording 2 parts. So consider this just the beginning. And whether you are a seasoned land steward or simply someone that is longing to reconnect with the rhythms of nature, this episode is a portal back into that knowing. So sit back and relax, and let's drop in.
Well, welcome to the Fallen Frequency Podcast. I'm super blessed and super excited to share my guest today. It's been a beautiful whirlwind of coming to Taos and just really getting adjusted by the land and this beautiful land of enchantment, truly. And in that process, I had the opportunity of actually doing a little work with you and learning a little bit more about his own Earthship, which we're in right now, as well as just sustainability and ecology and really just, natural building at its highest form. And so I'm really happy to have you here. Mm-hmm. And I guess just getting right into it, what brought you into all of this beauty and magic and having your own land and being self-sustainable and all of that?
Well, it's a long story, so I'll spare you some of the details. But suffice it to say that I did kind of get off grid at a very young age, and didn't necessarily fit in with the system.
Yeah.
So I don't have any experience of playing the game and then jumping out.
Yeah.
I just really jumped out as soon as I could.
That's great.
And I spent my high school years hitchhiking around the country, being a vagrant and learning in a different kind of way.
Yeah. Yeah, Earth school.
Yeah, and then I, at the young age of 18, was ready for a place to land, and came to Taos, and was immediately attracted to this idea of the cheap land out here, and ended up buying this 1 acre for $1,000.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's it. Wow.
And this house, I don't know if I told you this little story yet, but briefly, this was going to be a camp to get through the winter. And I had plans of what to build more in the center of the property. So this place literally grew very organically.
Wow.
As I ended up getting a job at the Earthships and learning about this way of building.
That's incredible.
Yeah, just literally blossomed up without any plans at all for the structure or necessarily where life was heading. But I did continue to hone my woodworking skills and did that professionally for a number of years, along with many other ventures.
Yeah, you're a man of many talents.
Yeah,
I mean,
I've done several things.
as many times as I've been in your place so far that I've been admiring something, I'm like, wow, where'd you get that from? And you're like, oh yeah, I built it. I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Self-sustainable, man. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I know we're going to get into a lot of the juicy details of ecology and soil health and really just like what allows us to be in harmony on the planet, truly. But first, I know I've been waiting to actually learn this myself about really the land of Taos. And a lot of people have these different stories of it being this very lush green area that then was desertified by humanity and the history and what had happened. But yeah, I would love to hear your own interpretation and what you, what you think.
Yeah. Well, thanks for being here to discuss it. And yeah, as I promised you, I've held out this part of our discussions for this because it is a very interesting story, and you're going to see how it's a much bigger story than the story of these particular lands outside.
Yeah.
But starting with that, there is an interesting phenomena which is local to this area, but it's also worldwide, where people say, oh, it used to be grasslands out there, and oh, it used to be forest out there before that, and it used to be cool, and there used to be water. And that's the broader story, but the part specific to this area is, oh, and then the Spanish brought all their sheep, and the sheep ate all the grass, and then the sage came.
Yeah.
And interestingly, some people even say the opposite. Oh, well, the sheep were well managed, and when they were removed, the sage came. But either way, it's a very reductive, kind of a scapegoat to a much, much larger story.
Right.
And what we end up finding out is that not only is it a larger story, but as I indicated, this is a story that you hear around the world. Outside in towns and villages and cities that are on the outskirts of these drying lands, which actually make up a great portion or even the vast majority of the habitable lands of the world.
Yeah.
If you think about the difficulty in living in rainforests or Arctic environments and how crowded, more ideal areas become, and look at some of those factors, we can see that these arid lands really do make up a huge, huge portion of the world.
Yeah.
And everywhere around the world, people actually say these same things. Oh, it used to be grassland out there, and it used to be forest before that. And it's not necessarily the sagebrush everywhere, but it is a similar woody species that will come to dominate. And in between the woody species is bare ground. And this is what the process of desertification looks like. It's a loss of biodiversity. It's an establishment of a singular species, this woody species, a shrub oftentimes, or almost always a shrub, woody species, and then bare ground in between. And within this whole understanding of what desertification is, we can see how there's a lot of times clay in the soil, not just here, but all over the world. And what happens when we lose the biodiversity is that the hard rains will bring the clay to the surface and cap off the ground, and then the water doesn't soak in anymore. And it just hits and runs off. So part of the story is around what hydrological cycles really are and the difference between a full cycle and a half cycle, which Schauberger talked about 100 years ago. But then the other big part of the story, which is what this holistic management thing is all about, is our relationship to ruminant animals. And how, and this is also what makes it a much larger story than, oh, the sheep ate all the grass. And the sheep are ruminant animals. And this indicates that it's all about the humans too. It's not, and a popular saying now is it's not the cow, it's the how. But when we look at the bigger picture, what we can see is that all of the grasslands, the herblands, and prairie lands of the world were built, not just maintained, but built by ruminant animals. acting in the herd and predator fashion.
Yeah.
So the ruminants are staying bunched together closely for their safety. And then they are eating evenly. And then they're also moving regularly because, not only because of fear of predation, but because they've eaten evenly and then they've dung and urinated evenly and it's time to move on.
Yeah.
And it's a system created by nature, which even indicates that nature is these sets of systems. You know, we use this word nature loosely, and nature, even in the reductionist Western paradigm of scientific thought, was reduced to this kind of view of mechanical dead elements.
Yeah.
Like that saying nature versus nurture
Yeah.
really implies that nature is a determined, fixed mechanical processes, you know. But really, nature is nurturing. So I personally think, luckily, we don't hear that saying as much anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
But anyway, the big story is that nature, as the set of systems, created the system, the herd and predator system, which built and maintained all of the grasslands of the world. And we'll get into why and how.
Yeah.
But it's not the sheep that upset this, and it's not necessarily, there's no need to blame any particular event, but more so to recognize that the growth of human populations upsets these natural systems. It's just the way it is.
Yeah.
We don't need to blame the natives or the Europeans, though there were explosions in the native populations, and then when the Europeans came west, they killed 500 to 600 million bison.
Jeez.
Yeah, so these are very important markers in history.
Yeah.
But even still so, it's a bigger story where the rise of human populations naturally offsets these balances. And that's where we come into our role as stewards
Yeah.
and the need to recognize that. You know? So the thing with grasslands in particular is that the mainstay of a grassland is a perennial clump grass. You know what I mean?
Maybe break that down a little bit more.
Well, they're grasses. Perennial means they come back every year,
Yeah.
and they're clumps as opposed to loosely dispersed species.
Yeah.
And they are the mainstays of an arid environment grassland.
Yeah.
And the thing about these perennial clump grass, there's many varieties. Even right here, there's 10 varieties that you can find right outside.
Yeah.
And then, of course, worldwide, many more. But they're all the same in that they need to be consumed and to regenerate by ruminant animals. Because that's what the ruminant is. It's a four-stomached animal in which the first big stomach is called the rumen. And this is the only part of life that recycles these cellulose materials.
Wow.
Other than in a compost pile or a very wet environment, you could have fungal decay.
Yeah.
But in this natural ecosystem, it is the role of the ruminant animal to eat these grasses and digest them. And they're the only ones that do it. We can't eat grass. We can't digest it.
Yeah.
The non-ruminants don't digest it. You know, so the rumen is full of biology that breaks these grasses down. And then, of course, their dung and urine is refertilizing the land. But even more critically, the grasses just plain old choke themselves out.
Wow.
And we're going to later on get into, I mentioned redox chemistry,
Yeah.
and how interesting a piece that is. Well, this has to do with the balance from reduced to oxidized. And what happens is that the clump grass, when it's full of vegetative material that's not being removed, that oxidizes. It turns into gray, dead material that's blocking the sun, blocking the environment from interacting with the species itself so that it regenerates. And then we lose soil health around, when we lose biodiversity, which includes diversity of plants, but also the diversity of biology in the soil.
Like all the microbes.
Yeah. Microbes and macrobes, you know,
Yeah.
earthworms and arthropods.
Yeah.
When we lose that, you may still see the grasses there, but they'll fail to regenerate. So what happens is that when we don't have the system, the herd and predator system, lands start to desertify. And unfortunately, they do it at a pace that's just slower than we would naturally perceive. and this is one of the key reasons why we don't recognize this problem, is that when we look out at these type of lands, they're beautiful.
Yeah.
Even desert ecosystems are beautiful.
Absolutely.
So we are often taken aback by the beauty. And we're often also, another primary reason why we don't notice is that we're also often not living in the middle of deserts, or, you know, it's not the most popular place to live.
Yeah.
But the degradation is happening at this pace. It's just slower than we perceive until we learn this story. Once you learn these signs, you can see it everywhere.
Right.
You know?
Well, it's funny because it makes me think about just, you know, growing up in elementary school and the American education system and learning about all these terrestrial biomes, and them just teaching desert is just another aspect of, you know, the tundra and the Arctic and, you know, all these different equatorial, you know, all these, but it's interesting that you're saying that there's a deeper reason to actually the desertification in a way that, like, these deserts aren't necessarily all just a natural part of the world.
Yes.
Yeah.
And pertinent to that is this fact that deserts are human created.
Wow.
Which is a big thing that Savory talks about in his book, Holistic Management. So
even every desert?
Not necessarily every one. That there's parts of the Gobi and the Sahara that have always been around.
Yeah.
But when we look at the vast majority of lands that people call deserts, they're human created.
Yeah.
Human induced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, I've heard of incredible stories of even in Africa where there's desert and using the cows and all the different ruminant animals and basically restoring over not even a full decade, making a very lush ecosystem of farming for, you know, that sustainability and growth. And it's really like hearing that was just adding these extra little seeds and questions in me of, wait, so everyone is saying that there's all this land that's destroyed and we can do nothing about it, but maybe there is actually a way that we can really bring this lush environment back and feed our people and everything around us as well.
Yeah. And it's not only that there potentially is, it's that, well, something I like to say in the vein of Alan Watts is not necessarily should we consider these solutions or could these solutions work, but more could we survive without them is the better question.
Yeah.
You know?
And I don't think so. That's great.
Yeah, and it's profound to see. I mean, one of our local examples in northern Mexico is a man named Alejandro Carrillo, who is doing this work that Savory talked about and others have taught about at a grand scale, a large scale, and on his own behalf as well. He spent a lot of his own money to figure this out, and he has a 25,000 acre ranch and is now working for Dr. Alan Williams with Understanding Ag company based out of the Southeast. And he's teaching all over the world about these practices, but essentially the story is that, and the pictures prove, you know, when you see his talks and meet him, a nice guy, but the story is that his ranch was hard pan Chihuahuan desert, white sand, cactus, prickly pear, desert. I mean, we call this area desert, major desert.
Yeah, like sand.
Sand, and he's regenerated diverse ecosystems with some grasses that are 4 and 6 feet tall using cattle only.
Holy moly.
No seeding, no tilling, no inputs other than seawater.
Yeah.
For the salt, for the minerals. So it's an amazing, amazing story.
Well, it just makes me laugh because it makes me think about how much I grew up to, and, you know, this, maybe we'll get into a little bit, but this whole narrative around climate change and the ecosystem, and we were taught to fear cows and having cows around because it would create more carbon gases in the environment and things like that. And really, they're such a big part of our, especially as I've grown and developed, and even learning from Paul Chek and all these different people that teach about the entire regenerative cycle of how we need these animals and this process, and actually even life and death process of being able to, you know, not only feed ourselves, but also feeding the soil through this process as well. It's been like a huge wake-up call for me.
Yeah, it is. It's profound.
Yeah.
And a big piece in relation to the climate is that we could contest it till the cows come home.
Yeah.
But a better way, perhaps, is to not question this narrative that atmospheric climate can warm the environment. That can be completely true.
Yeah.
Maybe there's not a need to question that. Maybe the need is to understand the difference in soil carbon versus atmospheric carbon and the quantity we're talking about. You know, the quantity of carbon in the atmosphere is 0.04%. You know, whereas and we've gone from 0.025 to 0.04 something.
Yeah.
So it is absolutely climbing. But plants enjoy a atmospheric carbon content up to 2,000 parts per million, which would be 0.2. So it's much higher.
Wow.
But when we look at soil carbon, we can see a content of anywhere from 0.1, 0.5, up to 30% of the soil can be carbon content.
Wow.
This is a huge, huge, huge difference,
Yeah.
you know, in quantity and how much a living soil can hold carbon. And in fact, it is even a basic function of life itself that the amount of carbon in the system represents the amount of energy that's held within the cycling of energy.
Right. And is that related to the sequestering of carbon into the soil?
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And this is the real story that we should be focused on, rather than any technological or artificial means of sequestering carbon, is that this is what life is all about.
Yeah.
This is what life is.
Right.
Unless we're moving to silicon-based life, then we are carbon-based life, and the soil is carbon-based life as well.
Right.
You know, which is and this word soil gets thrown around too. We should maybe touch on that for a moment, of what soil even actually is.
Yeah, I would love for you to define what soil is.
That there has been a big effort to distinguish soil from dirt.
Yeah.
And some people use the terms interchangeably, but it is well worth considering that there is a big difference in that dirt is the base materials. You know, rocks, minerals, clay, even liquids and gases, but without these other pieces that make soil, it's not. It's a inert matter, basically. And that soil has to have living organisms, stabilized organic material, which is carbon, and plants. You can't have soil without plants. And that when any of these four legs of the table are removed, it doesn't stand.
Right.
You know, you can also grow plants without soil in hydroponic systems. You know, you can cultivate microbes in the laboratory.
Yeah.
You can certainly consider artificial and technological means for sequestering carbon, but this is one integrated system.
Yeah.
You know, and the really interesting thing that I personally learned, and especially even after taking a course on redox chemistry, is that the true function of soil, now remembering what we just said, that it is a synergistic system between the dirt, plants, microbes, and carbon that form what soil is. But the true function of soil is not to be a substrate for plants, because you can't have it without plants. You know, in that way, we can see that plants are the substrate for soil, right?
Yeah.
So what's the real true function? The real true function, my friend, is to mitigate the fluctuation of all forms of energy on Earth. To mitigate and manage the fluctuation of all forms of energy.
Wow.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
So it's like a net for all of the different energy forms.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Damn. I'm going to have to sit with that one. That's deep.
It is. And it also relates to your work in that there's oftentimes within I'm not saying you're working in a reductionist paradigm.
Yeah.
But in our ways of Western thinking, you know, scientific thinking, there's often many variables and metrics that we're overlooking. Yeah. When we isolate things and think about them.
Totally.
And your work is fascinating with biogeometry. But one thing to consider is that these elements can actually be, as you know, they can be managed and changed.
Yeah.
But they can be changed by our practices of working with the energies. But what manages the energy to begin with?
Yeah.
You wouldn't be measuring anything, or there wouldn't be anything to measure if there weren't these life energies present to begin with.
Yeah.
So the flows of water and the areas of stabilized carbon are what's making these frequencies that you're working with available to begin
Absolutely.
with. So it's just a metric to consider that we can influence where water and where carbon are, and that's actually going to change the readings that we're going to get.
Totally.
You know?
Well, and especially, I mean, yeah, I feel I'm not even close to representing biogeometry to the level of someone like Ibrahim, but a lot of his work I know is actually the study of how nature's divine pen actually is what creates everything through the proper form and function and shape that creates the reality that we live in. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that being related to the netters, or the actual, as he has said, the nature, even the term nature comes from that netter, or the forces of nature that create from the higher planes into the physical realms. Yeah. And so just learning about that and seeing how that can be practically applied, and really trying to find a way to, at least for me, what interests me in what you're saying and things like biogeometry and all these different sciences that are bringing back this qualitative understanding, is that how can we actually bring the life force and vitality back into everything that we're creating? Just like, being in your house, I can tell that it's deeply connected and rooted, and you're grounded the entire time you're in your house. Most people could never say that for their whole life.
Yeah.
And so their vitality is consistently being drained on all day by not only their house, but everything that it's built with, all the chemicals, the EMFs, and it just goes on. And it's not something to fear per se, but the awareness, once you start to see what's around us and see all these ancient civilizations, I know we've talked about it, and I don't want to glorify us going back to the old ways, but how can we bring the old ways back into our new paradigm in a way that actually harmonizes these things? Because it's just, I don't know, it's like bleak at times, but also extremely inspiring.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is possible. It's and we'll get more into it, but seeing how to imagine the change and to move into it is critical.
Yeah.
And that was the piece that I wanted, before we move on, to touch on about the land, is just that shift in perception from, oh, this is a fixed thing, it is what it is out there, to it is something that's always changing.
Yeah.
Because of course we can look outside and see that in fact it is what it is.
Yeah.
But it is a shift in perception to understand that it's an ever evolving story.
Yeah.
Well,
it's like that saying that only constant is change, truly, and I see that especially in nature.
Yeah. So something I was going to say too is that you wouldn't hear these stories all around the world of it used to be grasslands and it used to be forest if there wasn't some truth in it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't walk out here with my cats and find arrowheads every day.
Yeah.
If there wasn't something to hunt out there before.
Yeah.
You wouldn't find these petrified remains of big trees and Douglas firs out here if they weren't there before. There is evidence still right here. You wouldn't see these ancient lake beds and fossilized aquatic animals if there wasn't once bodies of water. There is evidence all around once you learn to see it. And similarly with the grasses, some of the grass species out here, these perennial clump grasses, they're actually existing now in cryptobiotic circles. And we learn about these cryptobiotic circles in elementary school, that they're like an ancient form of life to be preserved. But they're also a sign that they're still there, and it could rapidly change. It's not so much, don't step on the cryptobiotic circle kind of a thing.
What is cryptobiotic?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what the science definition would be, but you can recognize it when you see it, that it's a circle that is very old. It's an old remnant of life, and it's a different way that plants and fungi kind of grow, other than their normal expressions of diverse and vital health, where they're just hanging on in this ancient circle. So again, I'd have to look at what the definition actually is.
Yeah.
But I remember the term from when I was young, in elementary school, and then I've seen it out here every day.
Yeah.
That these species that can be, vibrant clumps of grass are in these, barely hanging on circles. Yeah. So sure, maybe you shouldn't step on it, but you should also not step on your own awareness of, hey, this tells me that life was here and that we can bring life back.
Right.
So yeah, seeing that it's not just a fixed thing that can't be changed.
Yeah.
And then also this honoring of the animals, that animals are not just our ancestors in a potential evolutionary way, but that literally they created the place for us.
Right.
Very literally.
Yeah.
That the way that nature created these systems, such as the ruminant animals that have to eat the grass, and it's not only that, the herd and predator system also, with the cloven foot of the ruminant, opens up the ground, which is a key aspect of their behavioral patterns. So it's not just that they can function in this way, acting as a herd for their safety and that they're beneficial. It's also to understand that there's a big difference in the way that animals behave, given the circumstances of the environment. Humans no less.
Yeah.
All animals behave within this, and in fact, almost every aspect of life that we can consider operates within spectrums and continuums.
Yeah.
Not binaries and not...
Well, and they have, it seems like animals generally live in more of a holistic perception of the wholeness of everything. I've heard of different theories about that. They
do, but again, all animals can act in an unruly fashion.
Yeah.
So they may be more holistically aware. Of course, animals aren't using language. So in that way, we can assume they're more connected with an intuitive awareness. But all animals can behave on the spectrum from lazy and degenerative behavior to regenerative and socially cohesive. Just as we can see, you ever hear of the John Calhoun mouse studies? Where this guy in the 50s took mice and put them in a confined environment and gave them everything that they needed to survive, food and water, everything except space. And the behavioral patterns change from where they stop preening themselves, maintaining, and they stop flirting and mating, and then they start fighting.
Wow.
And their entire behavioral patterns become degenerative, societally degenerative, to where they end up destroying each other because of confinement.
No, what keeps coming up for me as you're speaking too, that I have thought about a lot, especially driving across country, and I see so much just completely open land, and there's almost nothing, and yet there's so much lack and scarcity in the US right now, like on such a deep level that I know is definitely a mental emotional issue, but it also is very much a physical issue as well. And it just makes me, you talking about that study makes me just think about, like, how can we, come to a more holistic understanding that actually brings us back into that harmony and gives us the space. Because even for me, I'm just fresh of leaving LA, and it's like already, like, even though I still don't necessarily know how certain things are unfolding, I still feel generally much better because I'm not just confined in this amount of space and in traffic and all these people and different things. And it makes me think of like Dunbar's number, that whole idea too of like, you're not really, or at least our brains are not really used to more than 150 connections or something like that, I believe. Yeah.
Well, it certainly has a lot to do with the manifestations of fear.
Yeah.
And a loss of courage and not per se the willingness to act, but the knowledge of how to act and what to do. is certainly connected with this being trapped in spaces and being trapped in economic systems that are based on the politics of scarcity.
Yeah.
That's how economics work, in that the less of something there is, the more it's worth.
Right.
Whereas with ecology, it's the other way around.
Yeah.
We want more and more and more,
Yeah.
So, and before we move on for the ruminants, I wanted to say too that human populations as we've risen have offset these balances. There have been big hits throughout history, but it's the bigger story is that it's a very, very long process where we disrupted nature's systems and particularly in this case the herd and predator system. But along the way, we have luckily domesticated ruminant animals. And we have this partnership with them that we can, and I think should, consider a divine relationship of mutual reciprocity.
Yeah.
And the way that we work with the cows determines how they end up behaving.
Yeah.
And the way that we have ended up using not just cows, but all ruminant animals in the West and now worldwide is a destructive practice.
Yeah.
So there is some truth in these narratives about how cows destroy the environment.
Yeah.
There is.
Yeah.
There's some, nuances to be picked out of both sides of these arguments so we can find the middle ground. And what we see with the way that cattle are used with set stocking rates, that a certain amount of land can handle a certain amount of cattle, that's based in some science, but it's based in the science of the way that the land is today rather than the way we want it to be 10 years from now.
Yeah.
So it requires some forward thinking. And then even within the context of ranchers that are well aware of intensive grazing and adaptive management and holistic management, there are real world hurdles, and challenges in between why they're not just going out and doing this.
Yeah.
But the big difference to understand about it is that set stocking rates are like giving your teenagers the keys to the car and $100 and tell them to go do whatever they want. They're going to likely form some destructive practices.
Yeah.
Compared to taking your kids to a soccer game where they're having team activity. It's a big difference,
Yeah.
And the thing with the cattle, they're following the same path to the same plant that they want to eat every day. They're not simulating this natural system of herd and predator with our domesticated animals unless we replicate the role of the predator, which is to keep them bunched tightly together and essentially to move them every day.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
It's not that complicated.
Yeah.
And if we don't overcome a threshold where we're moving towards replicating these systems, we do see, as I said, that livestock can be destructive to the land.
Yeah. Wow.
So,
well, even before, don't want to go on too much of a side tangent, but that's just making me think, are herding dogs, is that part of the importance of that
again,
as well?
Again, you wouldn't see that humans were intuitive enough to breed species for herding livestock if there wasn't a role for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, aren't we fortunate enough that we can do these things and already have this at our disposal?
Yeah.
Dogs and even different breeds, dogs that are specifically, like the blue heeler, have been bred for herding, for keeping the bunch together, and then other dogs, like the Border Collie and the Great Pyrenees, that are more protectors for the outside, that are going to watch out for unwanted predators and retrieve animals that have gone off astray.
Yeah.
Through different roles
Wow.
to achieve the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Let me just check the camera real quick. Make sure it's still rolling. Sweet. Well, yeah, I know a big part of which we've already gotten into a good bit, but I would love for you to just define ecology and what that is, because it's a word that's so thrown around today, and
It sure is.
it is definitely an important word, but I would love to hear your...
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. And it is something that, of course, the word can be used in a variety of different ways. The ecology of this or that. But it perhaps should relate to our study of ecosystems,
Yeah.
And perhaps we should be able to define it,
Yeah.
And in the maybe as early as the 70s, but definitely the 80s and 90s, people got into saying deep ecology to perceive that they were seeing a more profound nature of the interconnectedness of organisms, you know. But still they missed the mark, or they weren't quite there yet, and not to their own fault, but I think the information wasn't all in a cohesive availability yet.
Yeah.
You know, such as holistic management, because there are some different, even with soil science, our knowledge has come a long, long way.
Yeah.
You know, and during that time when people were developing this term deep ecology, some of the stuff like Elaine Ingham's work on the soil food web was still new. Bill Mollison working on permaculture, you know, Savory talking about cattle, but and of course Margulis and Lovelock talking about Gaia theory, which we'll get into. But these were disparate camps, you know. And what I'm saying is that we don't really have ecology yet until we're putting this together in a picture that informs us around how our interactions with organisms makes and maintains the soil carbon sponge, which we'll also talk a little bit about. But anyway, thank you for asking. My definition for ecology is the mutual reciprocity of interdependent organisms that regulate interconnected systems that make and maintain the living conditions of our planet.
That's beautiful.
Thanks. And I find that anything less is not really adequate, and also a particular emphasis on this interdependency of organisms.
Right.
That's what it's about. It's not, we don't have functioning natural systems and ecosystems without the roles of organisms. That this is what life is. So I'm extremely pro-life, and I'm not talking about the abortion issue, though that's an interesting one too. But this understanding that life creates life, and life in the state of vitality creates the conditions for more life.
Yeah.
Because we can see the opposite too, where we have morbidity perpetuating morbidity.
Yeah.
You know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and I would love for you to speak a little bit more about that reciprocity, because I feel like that is just such a big term right now, even for my own spiritual development.
Yeah, yeah. It is, and it's more than any type of idea of we owe each other anything, like it's an economic exchange.
Yeah.
It's a sacred reciprocity, where when we are involved in these processes of regeneration processes, and understanding that this is what all organisms are doing, that this is how we become more alive.
Yeah.
You know, this is how we heal and even potentially become happy.
Yeah.
That when we ignore these roles of reciprocity, we are ignoring a part of ourselves. And this is how I'm relating this back to the disconnect with nature, which is a term that people use. And of course, certainly you should go outside more, and you should put your hands in the soil, and you should forest bathe, and you should ground. But there's a deeper element to the connection with nature, which is that we're a part of these systems.
Yeah.
You know, and humans are not just the enemy of the living world. That in fact is a very dangerous and destructive view that is most unfortunately handed down to our children, creating an immense sense of nihilism and self-hatred.
Yeah.
You know, and sadness and...
Oh, totally. I feel like the natural innate guilt growing up of like, oh, am I hurting the environment? Am I a burden? You know, and even that deeper sense, I feel like a lot of people are still processing this idea and this feeling that they're a burden to the world and to society and things like that, and learning that we all have a part and a value in actually why we're here, and I mean even deeper into our purpose and our way of being and who we are, and it's not just about what we're doing but actually who we're being in that very moment. But yeah, I mean, well, and so I think shifting, if you're down to, I would love to learn more about how ecology plays into even like the Gaia theory and what Gaia theory even is actually. Yeah. Because I know very little about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, James Lovelock first came up with this idea in the 60s. He was measuring atmospheric gas content on this planet and others. And he found that the gases in our atmosphere exist in an anomalous state, which means that they would not exist in these proportions in a laboratory. And there's some interesting distinctions with our terminology where the word equilibrium in our language relating to scientific thought does not mean homeostasis. Equilibrium is often used more in the way that we would find materials separated in the lab. You know, and we'll get into that even more with entropy and non-equilibrium thermodynamics, because non-equilibrium thermodynamics is actually homeostasis. So there's a bit of nuance to how that word is used. But anyway, Lovelock was finding that the gases in our atmosphere exist in an anomalous state, anomalous proportions, that they would, in fact, some of the gas combinations would explode if they were in the lab in these combinations.
Wow.
So he's wondering what is making this possible, you know?
Yeah.
And Lovelock was an interesting character who lived to be 103 years old and died on the same day he was born.
Wow.
July 26.
That's impressive.
It is. So he's tooling around with these ideas around what is creating these conditions. And then he partners with Lynn Margulis, who was a fiery biologist who was championing ideas around symbiogenesis, about how organisms came together, different species came together to form new species. And I wish I could recite her 3 and 4 ideas that she was championing more thoroughly. But suffice it to say, she was a fiery character. And she didn't necessarily invent any new ideas. Some of these had been proposed before her, but she worked very hard and was very well known for championing these ideas around symbiogenesis.
Yeah.
And she was, in fact, a master biologist. I mean, she dedicated her life to science.
Yeah.
She was married at a young age to Carl Sagan, and they had 2 sons, I believe.
Oh, wow. So she was married to Carl Sagan.
Yeah.
Damn.
Yeah. And I don't think that lasted too long, but it's an interesting point. But partnering with Margulis enabled their partnership to formulate this idea called Gaia theory, because she brought the biological understanding of how organisms their actions are profound enough to change the ecosystem and create ecosystems. And that was what was needed to formulate this idea. Now, we'll back up for just a minute and say that unbeknownst to Lovelock, and I'm not sure about Margulis, but there were people who spoke about the biosphere before. There was a Russian author named Vladimir Vernadsky, who wrote about the biosphere. And a predecessor, someone who came before,
Yeah.
Seuss, Dr. Seuss, Eduard Seuss, an Austrian geochemist, maybe, I forget his working title, but he was actually one of the first to talk about the biosphere in the West. But if we back up further than that, we can see that the Buddha talked about mutual causality and dependent co-arising, about how all these systems are interconnected. So while there is a more definitive history that we can trace in our Western lineage, these ideas have always been around, you know.
Wow.
But Margulis and Lovelock formed it into a working scientific hypothesis, and then solidified as a theory. So an interesting thing about it is that I want us to talk about is, how would we know if it's true or not?
Yeah.
Who is qualified to say if this is accurate or not? But anyway, the Gaia theory, and what are some points of contention about it and misrepresentations?
Yeah.
Well, the word Gaia comes from the ancient Greek word for goddess. And they were skeptical of using this term for their scientific hypothesis for good reason.
Yeah.
Because it's not very scientific sounding, and it may, it may in fact tarnish their work or misdirect it, which I think that in fact it has. A better term that we can use today is called biospheric geophysiology.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah, it is, but again, anything less is really not quite. And these are terms that Margulis did use.
Yeah.
She did say geophysiology, and of course they did talk about the biosphere. So biospheric is just another way to say the biosphere.
Mm-hmm.
So biospheric geophysiology, the Gaia theory, what they were saying, and this is important to remember. Okay, this is the mechanics about it that are different from the interpretation of the mother goddess, the living, breathing, thinking, feeling planet, and that stuff's great. That's great. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's, it's a different thing than what this scientific idea was talking about.
Yeah.
This biospheric geophysiology said the temperature, the oxidation state, and the gaseous composition of our atmosphere are maintained and regulated by living organisms. The respiration and digestion of living organisms. And primarily we're talking about microorganisms. So that's it. That's the important part to remember. The temperature, the oxidation state, and the gaseous composition of our atmosphere are regulated by the actions of living organisms.
Yeah.
So again, the idea that we have a living mother goddess planet is great. It's wonderful.
Right.
But it's not really what they were talking about. And Lovelock did get more into speculating around these notions of what can also be called the noosphere, which was a term from Chardin, which is relating more directly to that, the cosmic consciousness or the unified consciousness and the thinking, the living planet in that way.
Yeah.
And again, that's great. That's great to think about it in that way. But it is well worth our consideration, especially talking about the temperature. We hear a lot about the temperature with this climate stuff, don't we?
Oh, yeah.
And the oxidation state.
Yeah.
The oxidation state, and this is where Margulis and Lovelock's work tied directly in with Alan Savory's work, talking about what I had described to you about how perennial grasses oxidize if they're not eaten by ruminant animals. So this is what redox chemistry is all about, is that in fact all life is and a function of life itself is to maintain this balance between reduced and oxidized. That is this is part of just what life is.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it makes me think a lot too about just what I've constantly meditated on, this idea that, the microcosm of the macrocosm, and this idea that really what's happening at a fractal level in the soil and all of the microbes and bacteria and parasites and all of these incredible beings are really a direct reflection of not only our health on top of the soil, but in the atmosphere and the temperature and things like that. And is that related to that?
Absolutely. Yeah. And there is an aspect of mind, the psyche, individually and collectively, that very directly relates to this.
Yeah.
And as we've already been discussing, our ability to perceive our selves as either, extractive, destructive, or as a needed steward of these systems. So there is absolutely a role of mind that plays into part. But there's also the geophysiology aspect. Yeah. And an interesting thing too about the redox is that redox is this scale from reduced to oxidized, but you know what else it is? It's a literal measurement of electricity. This is what the EH scale, we know about the pH scale, power of hydrogen, acid to alkaline. The EH scale is literally a measurement of millivolt electricity.
Is this related to the microcurrent level of millivolt? Or?
Certainly, certainly. And there's talk about how it is, in fact, within organisms, it is this measure of microcurrent or millivolt electricity that can be used as a metric for determining the susceptibility to states of illness. And interestingly, with another nuance of language, we find with electricity that the words positive and negative are switched around from our connotations of a value judgment, and that it's actually negative electricity, the earth is negative electricity. And similarly in cellular health, it's a negative measurement. So any cell that has a measurement of negative 300 millivolts will not be susceptible to any illness. And when it drops, as in goes closer to the positive, then you see susceptibility arising.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and that makes me think a lot about not only what I've learned a lot about with our states of consciousness when it comes to water, but also the circadian light biology that's now become, it's like rebirthing and becoming so popular now.
Yeah.
You know, Jack Cruz and all these people that are really going deep with it.
Yeah.
And I would like to get into some of that, but one thing I kind of want to take a little hawk's eye view of this, actually, and funny enough, I didn't even think about it, but your name is Hawkeye, and I'd love to know that story too, so I'm going to put a bookmark in that. But I would like to really possibly even examine, because I think you're a great person to ask about this, the state of science right now seems to be very co-opted and very driven by a lot of different industries that are really more in the money-driven, extractive type of paradigm. And I always love to bring the example, you know, I think we've done amazing things in science, but we tend to have this idea that because we can take a mouse apart and look at every organ that we understand how it works, yet we still have no clue how to put it back together and make it live again.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting part of science, but I'd love for you to maybe extrapolate a little bit on what's going on with science in today's world.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the question, and it's a big one for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a couple of things to separate. One is with the public perception around science, is that it has come to be equated with the scientific method, whereas originally the word simply means the process of discovery and the methods of inquiry. You know, science does not have to just mean the scientific method. And it is also within the public perception largely considered to be, again, something fixed, the settled science, trust the science.
Yeah.
Whereas that's not really how it works. You know, all scientists are always looking for the next discovery.
Yeah.
So scientists and science itself within the realm of scientists is a process of discovery. And it's not per se the scientists themselves that are guilty of this other side, which we'll get into. But it includes our public perception, and it's something to be aware of. You know, that just as I was saying with the land, that it's our choice to see it as something fixed and unchangeable versus a process of discovery and evolution. You know? So I personally am a fan of science. You know, I have a lineage of science in my family, and I read books in science, and I follow developments in scientific thought, and I think it's fascinating.
Yeah.
That being said, yes, on the other side of the coin, one thing that I have to say and like to say about it is that there is one thread that runs contiguous throughout the story of science in the West. One. One and one alone, which is that ideas that sell products get propped up, and ones that run contrary to corporate interests get swept under the rug.
Yeah. Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And yes, there is manipulation of everything from the peer review process to, you know, and before the peer review process, who was selected to be members of the boards of the Royal Academies and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And one basic thing to consider with that, within our history of the West, is that our relationship with business and economy actually flourished before this development of science. So it's not hard to see that business and money interests were pulling the strings.
Yeah.
I mean, that was already well established.
Yeah.
You know, so it is a fact of the matter, but it only takes us digging a little bit deeper. You know, and the way to truly become informed is to take in information from a wide variety of sources, and then to be able to discern for yourself.
Yeah.
There's no other way around that part of it.
Yeah,
you
I mean,
know?
well, just having a curious and open mind, I think I feel blessed that my parents created an atmosphere that included that as part of my paradigm, because I mean, I think it really came up for a lot of people, you know, around 2020. I mean, I just started looking around, and I luckily grew up with a holistic chiropractor and doctor that had educated me on the entire industry of science and pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
That I was quite aware that there was something weird going on that was not just about keeping people safe.
Yeah.
And that's definitely like was a huge part of, you know, my awakening and questioning everything else, because it's like, and I mean, that's a whole other conversation in itself, but it really has deeply interested me in the human psyche, in realizing that actually, I used to think it was a problem with the information being out there, but actually I realized all the information is out there. I could read a book to someone, you know, that is completely peer reviewed and published and, you know, all of the things, and they wouldn't, it's like they block it out because it's too much to possibly shift their paradigm of what they've been building everything on.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's not to say that they're bad for that or there's anything wrong with that, but it's been disappointing at times because I really wanted to keep educating myself to prove my point, to hopefully awaken people. But I realized, oh, wait, if they don't, it's like the whole concept of you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. I mean, it's like, it's there right in front of them, but
yeah. And it's tough. It's a difficult position to be in sometimes. But I would say for the listening and viewing audience that if there are elements of your understanding that are very dogmatic or very settled, it's worthwhile to question them to the extent of not just because there's a general perception that there's the accepted scientific truth and then there's crazy conspiracy theorists.
Yeah.
Well, with almost all of these diverse ideas on everything from cows to, you know, such things as inoculations, there's not just a few kooky characters that talk, you know, alternative crazy ideas. No, there's perhaps hundreds, if not thousands, of books and papers, you know, and documentaries and lectures that can be reviewed, you know, to reshape your understanding around these things. So it is unfortunate that, a lot of people do become very fixed and within the realms of cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias, you know, they're not willing to hear. But there is a wealth of information around all topics, and it is worthwhile to do as we're doing now and to find other people that have diverse ideas and talk with each other.
Absolutely.
You know, and then we can not only reshape, you know, our own understanding of what's going on with science and what science is, but through doing what we're doing on a large scale, we can reshape public perception around how there really is no such thing as settled science.
100%.
Thanks again for listening, y'all. This conversation with Joseph is one I'll be chewing on for a long time, I'll tell you that. His ability to weave science, spirit, and soil into a cohesive vision of regeneration is truly something special. We ended up going so deep that the camera couldn't even keep up, as you can see. So stay tuned for part 2, where we continue exploring these essential themes. And in the meantime, if you're feeling inspired to get your hands in the dirt, observe the land with new eyes, or rethink the systems that you're participating in, then this is your invitation. Remember, regeneration isn't just possible, it's a natural thing to return to the intelligence of life itself. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you on part 2. And remember to share this with someone that you think might enjoy this, as well as like and subscribe to keep helping me grow this channel and get the goodness of nature, art, music, and holistic health back into the world.